When the oncologist told me I had 6 months to live, my first thought wasn't about the pain or the treatments or even saying goodbye. It was about making sure everything was perfectly arranged for my children after I was gone. What I never expected was to overhear them in my kitchen 3 weeks later, calculators out, dividing up my life's work like vultures picking at roadkill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That conversation changed everything. And by the time they realized what I'd done, it was far too late to stop me. The morning I decided to plan my own funeral started like any other Tuesday in October. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the maple tree in my backyard shed its golden leaves, completely unaware that this would be the day my entire world shifted on its axis. The hospice nurse had left an hour earlier after checking my vitals and adjusting my medication schedule. The cancer was aggressive, she'd explained in that gentle but clinical way they're trained to use, and we needed to focus on comfort now rather than fighting. At 78 years old, I thought I understood death. I'd buried my parents, my husband Richard 5 years ago, and more friends than I cared to count. But facing my own mortality felt like standing at the edge of an abyss I'd only observed from a safe distance. The difference between watching someone else's boat disappear over the horizon and realizing you're the one sailing away from shore. My name is Eleanor Patricia Brennan, though most people just call me Ellie. I've lived in this same 4-bedroom colonial house in Millbrook for 43 years, raised 3 children within these walls, and built what I thought was a close-knit family. My eldest daughter Sarah is 47, a real estate agent with 2 teenage boys and a husband who manages a small accounting firm. My middle child Michael is 44, divorced, working as an insurance adjuster and struggling to keep up with alimony payment. My youngest, Jennifer, turned 41 last month and teaches 3rd grade while her husband runs a struggling landscaping business. They're good people, my children, at least. That's what I told myself every day until that October morning, when everything I believed about them crumbled like autumn leaves. The diagnosis had come 6 weeks earlier, during what I thought was a routine checkup. Martinez had found a mass during my physical examination, and the subsequent tests revealed pancreatic cancer that had already spread to my liver. Stage 4, inoperable, with a prognosis that made my blood run cold. 6 to 9 months, he'd said. Maybe a year with aggressive treatment that would likely make me miserable without significantly extending my life. I chose comfort care instead. At my age, with Richard gone and my children grown with families of their own, the idea of spending my remaining months, nauseated from chemotherapy, weak and dependent, held no appeal. I wanted to die with dignity, in my own home, surrounded by the memories that had shaped my life. The children had taken the news as well as could be expected. Sarah cried for hours, clinging to me like she had as a little girl after nightmares. Michael went into problem-solving mode, researching experimental treatments and second opinions, until I gently but firmly told him I'd made my choice. Jennifer, my emotional baby, alternated between tears and angry determination that I was giving up too easily. But they'd rallied around me in the weeks that followed, taking turns visiting, bringing groceries, handling the medications, and medical appointments. Sarah had even suggested moving in temporarily to help care for me, though I'd declined. I valued my independence too much to surrender it before absolutely necessary, and honestly I wanted these final months to be peaceful, rather than filled with the well-meaning chaos that 3 worried adult children could create. That Tuesday morning, however, something had shifted in my perspective. Perhaps it was the way the hospice nurse had looked at me, with that particular mixture of compassion and professional assessment, that suggested my timeline might be shorter than originally estimated. Or maybe it was simply the crisp October air reminding me that another season was ending, and I might not see another spring. Whatever the catalyst, I found myself thinking about practical matters. My will was current and legally sound, drafted by Thomas Henley, the estate attorney who'd handled Richard's affairs 5 years ago. My life insurance policies were in order, my bank accounts simplified, my important documents organized in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. But there were so many other details that needed attention, the kind of personal touches that would make my passing easier for my children to navigate. I wanted to plan my own funeral. The idea might seem morbid to some people, but it felt like the ultimate act of consideration for my family. They would be grieving, overwhelmed with emotion and the 100 small decisions that death requires. If I could handle the arrangements myself, choose the flowers and music and readings that truly reflected my life, they could focus on saying goodbye rather than guessing what I would have wanted. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making lists. First, the basics: burial rather than cremation, a simple wooden casket, placement beside Richard in Riverside Cemetery where we'd already purchased our plots. The service should be at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church where I'd been a member for 37 years, with Pastor Williams officiating if he was available. For music, I wanted traditional hymns that meant something to me personally rather than whatever was currently popular at funeral. Amazing Grace because it had been Richard's favorite, How Great Thou Art, because I'd sung it as a solo in the church choir for 20 years, and maybe In the Garden because it reminded me of the hours I'd spent nurturing the roses and vegetables that had filled our backyard for decades. The flowers should be simple, I decided, white roses mixed with baby's breath, perhaps some of the autumn chrysanthemums that were blooming so beautifully in my front garden. Nothing ostentatious or expensive, just natural beauty that would provide comfort without financial strain on my children. As for the reception afterward, the church fellowship hall would be perfect. I could pre-arrange the catering with Morrison's, the local restaurant that had been handling church events for years. Nothing fancy, just the kind of comforting food that helps people through difficult days. Casseroles and sandwiches, coffee and tea, maybe some of those little cookies that Mrs. Patterson always brought to church socials. Writing these details felt strangely soothing, like organizing a party where I wouldn't be present, but could still ensure everything went smooth. I thought about the people who should be notified, the friends and neighbors who'd shared significant portions of my life. My address book was thorough, but I wanted to create a specific list of those who'd meant the most to me over the year. There was Margaret Chen, my closest friend since Jennifer started kindergarten and we met at a PTA meeting. She'd been my companion for countless shopping trips, movie nights, and the kind of heart-to-heart conversations that sustained women through marriages, child-raising, and widowhood. Then Harold and Betty Williams from next door, who'd been our neighbors for over 30 years and had become like family, especially after Richard's death. I included my cousin Ruth from Philadelphia, my last remaining relative from my generation, and the women from my quilting circle who'd been meeting monthly for 15 years. Each name on the list represented a thread in the fabric of my life, people who'd shared joys and sorrows, ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary celebrations. The obituary would need to be written as well, and I wanted to craft it myself rather than leaving my children to struggle with summarizing my life while dealing with their grief. I thought about how to capture 8 decades of living in a few paragraphs, the highlights and accomplishments that had defined my journey. Born Eleanor Patricia Walsh in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1945, the daughter of Irish immigrants who valued education and hard work above all else. Graduated from Boston University with a degree in elementary education, though I'd only taught for 3 years before Richard and I married and I focused on raising our family. 48 years of marriage to the love of my life, Richard James Brennan, who'd preceded me in death by 5 years. 3 children who'd grown into successful adults, 5 grandchildren who brought me immense joy, and a lifetime of service to my community through church committees, school volunteer work, and neighborhood organizations. I'd been a room mother, a scout leader, a member of the hospital auxiliary, and a volunteer at the food bank for over 20 years. But how do you capture the essence of a person in newsprint? The way I'd sung lullabies to colicky babies at 2 in the morning, or stayed up all night with teenagers who needed to talk through heartbreaks and disappointments. The thousands of meals cooked, scraped knees, bandaged, birthday parties organized, Christmas mornings orchestrated, the small daily kindnesses that probably mattered more than any formal accomplishments, bringing soup to sick neighbors, sending birthday cards to friends' grandchildren, remembering to ask about elderly acquaintances' doctor appointments. The way I'd learned to change oil in my car after Richard died, because I refused to be dependent on mechanics who might take advantage of a widow. The garden I'd cultivated not just for its beauty, but because fresh vegetables and flowers brought me a sense of purpose and connection to the natural world. As I worked on these lists and reflections, I found myself thinking about legacy in broader terms than just funeral arrangements. What would I leave behind besides financial assets and household possessions? What values had I tried to instill in my children? What wisdom had I gathered over nearly 8 decades that might benefit them as they navigated their own challenge? I thought about the importance of resilience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ability to adapt and persist through difficulties that life inevitably brings. My generation had lived through significant historical changes: the civil rights movement, the space program, multiple wars, technological revolutions that transformed how we communicated and worked. I'd watched my children grow up in a world vastly different from my own childhood, and I'd tried to help them develop the flexibility to thrive despite uncertainty. Financial responsibility had been another cornerstone of my value. Richard and I had lived modestly, saving consistently, avoiding the kind of debt that enslaves people to jobs they hate or purchases they can't afford. We'd paid off our mortgage early, maintained emergency funds, and invested carefully for retirement. Not because we were wealthy, but because we understood that financial security provided freedom and peace of mind that no material possession could match. Family loyalty had been paramount as well, though I was beginning to question whether I'd emphasized that principle at the expense of teaching my children to think critically about relationships and boundaries. I'd always encouraged them to support each other, to put family obligations before personal convenience, to maintain connections even when personalities clashed or circumstances made relationships difficult. Kindness to others, especially those less fortunate, had been a daily practice in our household. Richard and I had modeled generosity through our volunteer work and charitable giving, though we'd never made a show of our contribution. We'd taught our children that privilege came with responsibility, that their education and opportunities obligated them to help others who hadn't been as fortunate. Religious faith had provided structure and comfort throughout my life, though I'd tried not to impose my beliefs on my children as they became adults. I wanted them to understand the difference between spiritual principles that could guide ethical decision-making and religious dogma that might limit their ability to think independently. Personal integrity had been perhaps the most important value I'd tried to model: keeping promises, telling the truth even when it was uncomfortable, taking responsibility for mistakes, treating everyone with respect regardless of their social or economic status. I'd taught my children that reputation was built through consistent actions over time, not through grand gestures or impressive achievement. As I contemplated these principles and their impact on my children's development, I realized I wanted to write letters to each of them, separate from the funeral planning, but connected to the same impulse to leave them with something meaningful. Not sentimental goodbye notes, but thoughtful reflections on their individual strengths and the hopes I held for their continued growth. For Sarah, I wanted to acknowledge her natural leadership abilities and business acumen while encouraging her to trust her instincts more completely. She'd always been my responsible child, the one who organized family gatherings and remembered everyone's birthdays, but she sometimes second-guessed herself in professional situations where her judgment was usually sound. Michael needed encouragement to value his own worth beyond his ability to solve other people's problems. He'd always been the family peacemaker, smoothing over conflicts and putting others' needs before his own, sometimes to his own detriment. His divorce had shaken his confidence, and I wanted him to understand that setbacks didn't define his character or predict his future happiness. Jennifer required gentle guidance about financial planning and long-term thinking. She'd inherited my generous nature but sometimes made impulsive decisions that created unnecessary stress. Her teaching career was noble but not highly compensated, and I worried about her family's financial security as her own children approached college age. These letters would be private gifts, not part of the official estate documentation, but personal messages to be discovered after my death. I imagined them finding these reflections weeks or months later, when the initial grief had softened enough to allow for deeper contemplation of our relationship and their own life journey. The afternoon sun was slanting through my kitchen windows as I continued planning, creating detailed lists and thoughtful arrangements. I felt productive and purposeful in a way I hadn't experienced since receiving my diagnosis. This was something concrete I could accomplish, a final gift of organization and consideration that would ease my children's burden during an already difficult time. Around 4 o'clock, I heard Sarah's car in the driveway. She'd been stopping by every few days, often bringing groceries or just checking to see if I needed anything. Her visits were usually brief but warm, filled with updates about her boys' school activities and her work in real estate. She had a spare key and typically let herself in, calling out a greeting as she entered. "Mom, it's me," she announced from the front door. "I brought those magazines you wanted and some of that herbal tea you've been drinking." I quickly gathered my planning materials and tucked them into the drawer of the kitchen table. Something made me want to keep these arrangements private for now, perhaps until they were more completely developed or maybe until closer to the end. Sarah didn't need the additional emotional weight of detailed funeral planning while she was still processing my diagnosis and prognosis. "I'm in the kitchen, sweetie," I called back, smoothing down my shirt and arranging my expression into something more casual than the focused intensity I'd been maintaining all day. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying 2 grocery bags and wearing the slightly strained smile she'd adopted since learning about my cancer. She was dressed in her professional attire, a tailored blazer and slacks that projected the competence and reliability her real estate clients expect. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she'd lost weight since my diagnosis, probably from stress and the disrupted eating patterns that came with worry. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, setting the bags on the counter and beginning to unpack them. "You look good. I mean, you have more color than yesterday." I appreciated her effort to find positive observations, even when they stretched credibility. The truth was that I felt increasingly tired each day. My appetite continued to diminish, and the medication made me feel disconnected from my body in ways that were sometimes unsettling. But Sarah needed to believe I was comfortable, and I needed to protect her from the full reality of my physical decline for as long as possible. "I'm having a good day," I replied honestly. "I've been working on some organizing projects, getting my papers in order. Nothing urgent, just the kind of tidying up that makes me feel productive." She nodded approvingly while arranging items in my refrigerator. "That's smart, Mom. I know how much you like having everything organized. Is there anything specific you need help with? I could stay for a while if you want to go through documents or boxes or anything like that." The offer was genuinely caring, but I wasn't ready to share my funeral planning with anyone yet. "Thank you, dear, but I'm managing fine for now. I promise I'll ask for help when I need it." We spent the next hour chatting about ordinary things: her son's progress in school, a difficult client she was working with, plans for Halloween decorations. Normal conversation that felt precious, because we both understood it wouldn't be available indefinitely. Sarah was trying to maintain our usual dynamic while processing her own grief about my impending death, and I was balancing my desire to comfort her with my need to prepare for practical realities. After she left, I returned to my planning with renewed focus. The afternoon's interruption had reminded me how important it was to complete these arrangements while I still had the energy and mental clarity to make thoughtful decisions. The cancer was progressing, despite the medications designed to slow its advance, and I couldn't predict when I might become too sick to handle complex tasks. I called Morrison's restaurant and spoke with Janet, the catering manager who'd handled numerous church events over the years. She was sympathetic and professional when I explained what I needed, offering to create a comprehensive package that would include food, beverages, and service for the post-funeral reception. "Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know how sorry I am about your diagnosis," she said quietly. "You've been such a fixture in our community for so many years. I remember you bringing your children in for birthday dinners when they were little." Her kindness brought unexpected tears to my eyes. These connections with longtime neighbors and local business owners represented another layer of my life that would end with my death. Janet had served our family for over 20 years, witnessing graduations and anniversaries, celebrating achievements and comforting during difficulty. "Thank you, dear," I managed. "That means more than you know." Now about the arrangements. We discussed menu options, guest numbers, and logistics. I wanted everything prepaid so my children wouldn't need to handle financial transactions while dealing with their grief. Janet assured me she would create a detailed contract that covered every aspect of the reception, from setup to cleanup, removing one more burden from my family's shoulders. Next, I contacted Riverside Cemetery to confirm the details of Richard's burial plot and arrange for my own interment. The superintendent, Mr. Rodriguez, had been there when we'd buried Richard 5 years ago, and he remembered our family. He walked me through the process with gentle efficiency, explaining the timeline and procedures while answering questions I hadn't known to ask. "Will there be anything special you'd like for the gravesite?" he asked. "Flowers, decorations, particular timing for the service?" I thought about Richard lying alone in that peaceful corner of the cemetery, surrounded by mature oak trees and the small memorial garden maintained by volunteers. Soon I would join him there, and the prospect brought comfort rather than fear. We'd been partners for 48 years, and while I'd learned to live independently after his death, I was ready to be reunited with him in whatever form that reunion might take. "Simple and natural," I replied. "Richard always loved the fall foliage, so if the timing works out, maybe something that reflects the season." Pastor Williams was equally accommodating when I reached him that evening. He'd officiated at Richard's funeral, and had provided pastoral care during my own spiritual struggles in the months that followed. A thoughtful man in his 60s, who balanced theological wisdom with practical compassion, he understood my desire to plan my own service. "Eleanor, I think what you're doing is both wise and generous," he said when I explained my intentions. "So many families struggle with funeral arrangements when they're grieving. By handling these details yourself, you're giving your children a gift of time and emotional space to process their loss." We discussed the service structure, the readings I wanted included, and the music selections I'd identified. Pastor Williams suggested adding a time for family members to share memories if they felt comfortable doing so, and I agreed that could provide meaningful closure for those who wanted to participate. "I'd like to focus on gratitude rather than grief," I told him. "My life has been full of blessings, and I want the service to reflect that abundance rather than dwelling on the sadness of ending." The food bank that didn't really need the money served over 300 families each month, including several elderly residents of our neighborhood who struggled to afford both medications and adequate nutrition on fixed incomes. My modest monthly contributions helped purchase fresh produce and protein sources that government commodity programs didn't provide. To characterize this giving as irresponsible revealed a callousness I'd never suspected in my children. Sarah's voice took on a more calculating tone. "The question is whether we should try to intervene now, or just wait it out. Her prognosis is 6 months or less, so any major financial damage would be limited. But if she starts making significant donations or decides to renovate the house, or something equally pointless, we might need to consider other options." "What kind of other options?" Jennifer asked. "Power of attorney for financial decisions," Michael replied. "If we can document that she's not thinking clearly about money, we might be able to convince her doctor to support a competency evaluation." The conversation paused while they apparently considered this possibility. I pressed myself against the wall, afraid they might discover my presence, but unable to leave without hearing how this discussion would conclude. "I don't think we're there yet," Sarah finally said. "She's definitely slowing down physically, but she's still pretty sharp mentally, and she's always been stubborn about independence. Pushing too hard might backfire and make her suspicious of our motives." Our motives? The phrase crystallized everything I'd been hearing into stark clarity. They weren't concerned about my well-being or comfort during my final months. They were protecting their financial interests, viewing my autonomy as a threat to their inheritance, rather than respecting my right to make my own decisions about my own resources. "Besides," Sarah continued, 6 months isn't that long to wait. We just need to monitor the situation and be prepared to act if she starts making really poor choices." "Like what?" Jennifer asked. "Major charitable donations, expensive home improvements, maybe even remarriage if some old widower starts paying attention to her," Michael said with a bitter laugh. You'd be surprised how many elderly people make impulsive decisions that destroy their family's financial security. The idea that remarriage at my age would constitute an impulsive decision that threatened their financial security revealed how completely they'd commodified our relationship. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was an asset portfolio they were managing until they could claim ownership. Should we say anything to her about being more careful with money? Jennifer asked. Maybe frame it as concern for her future care needs. I've tried that approach, Sarah replied. She just says she's been managing finances longer than any of us, and she's perfectly capable of making her own decisions. She gets defensive when we bring up money at all, because I could sense their underlying agenda, even if I hadn't understood its full scope until now. My defensive reactions weren't symptoms of declining mental capacity, but appropriate responses to their attempts to control decisions that were rightfully mine to make. Michael's voice carried a tone of resignation mixed with anticipation. Well, we just have to be patient, keep monitoring her spending, maintain our relationship so she doesn't get suspicious, and be ready to move quickly once the time comes. The important thing is that we all understand what needs to happen and we're prepared to handle it efficiently. Speaking of efficiency, Sarah said, we should probably start identifying which items from the house we actually want to keep. I've been thinking about her china cabinet and the dining room set. They're both real wood, probably worth refinishing. I want Dad's tools. Michael said. They're still in good condition, and I could actually use them, plus his fishing gear, if nobody else is interested. I'd like some of her jewelry and maybe the quilts from her sewing room, Jennifer added. The kids might want some of the family photos too when they're old. They were dividing my possessions as if I were already gone, claiming items they wanted while dismissing everything else as sentimental junk, suitable only for an estate sale. The casual way they discussed dismantling my home revealed how little sentimental value my life held for them beyond its monetary worth. I backed away from the kitchen doorway on unsteady legs, my heart pounding with a combination of shock, anger, and profound sadness. The children I'd raised, the family I'd devoted my life to supporting and nurturing, had reduced our relationship to a financial transaction they were eagerly waiting to complete. Everything made sense now. Their increased attention since my diagnosis, their helpful organization of my medications and emergency contacts, their insistence on spending time together for family bonding. They weren't motivated by love or genuine concern for my comfort during my final month. They were positioning themselves to claim their inheritance as efficiently as possible while ensuring I didn't make any decisions that might reduce its value. I managed to return to my chair in the living room and arrange myself in a natural position before they finished their kitchen conversation and rejoined me. When they appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, their expressions were warm and caring, showing no trace of the calculating discussion I'd just overheard. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Jennifer asked with apparent concern. "You look a little pale. Maybe you should rest for a while." The solicitude in her voice felt obscene after what I'd just heard. I wanted to confront them immediately, to demand explanations and express my outrage at their betrayal. But something held me back, some instinct that confrontation would be premature and counterproductive. "I'm just tired," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The medication makes me drowsy sometimes." They accepted this explanation without question, gathering their coats and bags while making reassuring comments about checking on me later in the week. Sarah reminded me to call if I needed anything. Michael promised to bring groceries on Saturday, and Jennifer suggested we might have another family lunch soon. After they left, I sat in my chair for a long time, staring out the window at the gray November afternoon while processing what I'd learned. The children I'd loved unconditionally, supported through every challenge, and sacrificed for without reservation, had been revealed as strangers who valued my money more than my life. The funeral I'd been planning so carefully, the legacy gifts I'd prepared with such thought and love, the obituary I'd crafted to honor my relationships and contributions, all of it suddenly felt like elaborate preparations for people who didn't deserve my consideration. But as the initial shock began to fade, it was replaced by something harder and more determined. If my children wanted to play games with my assets, they were going to discover that their supposedly declining mother was still capable of strategic thinking. They'd made the mistake of underestimating me, and that error would cost them more than they could possibly imagine. I spent the rest of that afternoon making plans, real plans this time, not the gentle arrangements of a loving mother trying to ease her children's burden. If they wanted to treat my death as a business transaction, then I would approach it with the same cold calculation they demonstrated in my kitchen. The first step was gathering complete information about my actual financial situation, not the modest savings and pension income they assumed represented my total worth. Over the decades since Richard's death, I'd been far more successful with investments than any of them realized. My apparent frugality hadn't been due to limited resources, but to careful management that had allowed my portfolio to grow substantially. They were going to be very surprised when they learned the true value of the inheritance they'd been so eagerly anticipating. And they were going to be even more shocked when they discovered I'd found far better uses for that money than supporting their comfortable lifestyles. The game had changed completely, and this time I would be the one controlling the rules. The sleepless night that followed changed everything. I lay in my bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows, my mind racing through possibilities and calculations I hadn't considered since Richard's death 5 years ago. The gentle, trusting widow who'd been planning a thoughtful funeral for ungrateful children had died that afternoon in my kitchen. In her place was someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and significant resources at her disposal. By dawn, I had formulated the beginning of a plan that would ensure my children learned the true cost of their greed and callousness. They wanted to treat my death as a financial windfall, then they would discover exactly how expensive their attitude would become. The first step was understanding the full scope of my assets, something I hadn't reviewed comprehensively since Richard's death. I'd been content to live modestly on my pension and the income from conservative investments, allowing the principal to grow undisturbed. Now I needed to know precisely what I was working with. I called my financial advisor Friday morning. Despite the early hour, Patricia Sanderson had been managing my portfolio for 15 years, ever since Richard and I first decided we needed professional guidance for our retirement plan. She was a sharp woman in her 60s, who'd built her practice on serving clients who valued steady growth over flashy returns. "Eleanor," she said warmly when she heard my voice, "I've been thinking about you since receiving your letter last month. How are you managing with everything?" I'd informed Patricia about my diagnosis shortly after receiving it, wanting to ensure she understood the timeline we were working with for any necessary financial planning. She'd responded with professional sympathy and practical questions about my intentions for the portfolio during my remaining months. "I'm as well as can be expected," I replied. "Patricia, I need to schedule a meeting to review my complete financial picture. Something's come up that requires me to make some significant decisions about my estate planning." She didn't question the urgency in my voice, understanding that terminal illness often prompted reassessment of long-held arrangements. We scheduled an appointment for Monday morning at her office, giving me the weekend to prepare my questions and gather relevant documents. After hanging up, I made my second call to Thomas Henley, the estate attorney who'd handled Richard's will and my own basic document. Thomas was semi-retired now, working only with longtime clients, but he'd known our family for decades and would understand the sensitivity of what I needed to discuss. "Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise," he said when his secretary connected our call. "I hope you're feeling as well as possible under the circumstances." "Thank you, Thomas. I need to schedule an appointment to discuss some substantial changes to my will and estate planning. It's become urgent due to some family developments I'd rather not discuss over the phone." Thomas had been practicing law long enough to recognize when clients were dealing with complicated family dynamics around inheritance issues. He offered to meet with me Tuesday morning, noting that he would need a few days to review my current documents and prepare for whatever modifications I had in mind. "Should I expect this to involve significant restructuring of your estate plan?" he asked carefully. "Complete restructuring," I confirmed. "I'll be changing beneficiaries, establishing new trusts, and creating charitable foundations. We'll need to ensure everything is legally bulletproof and cannot be contested successfully." The gravity in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of my intentions, because Thomas immediately shifted into his most professional mode. I'll block out the entire morning for our meeting and have my research assistant prepare materials on trust structures and charitable giving strategies. Eleanor, are you certain you want to make major changes during this time? Sometimes terminal illness can affect our judgment about family relationships. My judgment has never been clearer, I replied firmly. The illness has simply revealed truths I should have recognized years ago. With those appointments scheduled, I spent the weekend conducting my own investigation into my children's financial situations. I'd always respected their privacy as adults, avoiding intrusive questions about their income, debts, or spending habits. Now I wished I'd paid closer attention to the gaps between their lifestyles and their presumed earning capacity. Sarah's real estate career appeared successful based on her professional reputation and client base, but I began noticing details that suggested financial strain. Her designer clothing and expensive handbags, which I'd attributed to professional necessity, might actually represent unsustainable spending. The private school tuition for her 2 sons would be substantial, and her husband's accounting practice was small enough that his income probably varied significantly from year to year. Michael's situation was more obviously precarious. His divorce settlement had been expensive, requiring him to maintain alimony payments while supporting his daughter during her visit. His insurance adjuster salary was steady but modest, and he'd mentioned several times that he was concerned about saving for Emma's college expenses while managing his current obligation. Jennifer's household relied on 2 relatively low incomes, her teacher's salary and her husband's landscaping business that was seasonal and dependent on weather conditions. They lived in a modest home but seemed to struggle with unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills. She'd asked me for small loans several times over the years, always with promises to repay that had never materialized. Understanding their financial pressures helped explain their eager anticipation of my death, but it didn't excuse their willingness to view me as merely an obstacle between themselves and relief from their money problem. Families should support each other during difficult times, but not by dehumanizing elderly parents and counting their assets like buried treasure waiting to be claimed. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of November day that made autumn's beauty visible despite the approaching winter. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Patricia, choosing a navy blue suit that projected competence and authority rather than the comfortable casual clothes I'd been wearing during my final illness. Patricia's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, her practice deliberately small and personal rather than corporate. She greeted me with genuine warmth but professional discretion, leading me to her private office where my files were already spread across her conference table. "I've pulled together everything from your accounts," she began, settling into her chair across from me. "Eleanor, I have to say I'm impressed by how well your portfolio has performed, especially considering the conservative approach we've maintained." She handed me a comprehensive statement showing account balances, asset allocation, and performance history for the past 5 years. The numbers were significantly higher than I'd expected, reflecting both the steady contributions I'd made since Richard's death and the compound growth that had accumulated over 15 years of careful investing. "The total value is currently just over $1.2 million, Patricia explained. "That's not including your house, which should add another $400,000 or so to your net worth, plus your life insurance policies and any other assets I'm not managing direct. $1.6 million minimum, probably closer to 1.8 when everything was calculated. My children had been planning to divide an inheritance they'd estimated at perhaps $600,000 total. They were going to be very surprised to learn how substantial their greed had actually been. "Patricia, I need to restructure everything," I said, my voice steady and determined. "I want to establish charitable foundations, create educational trusts for my grandchildren, and minimize what goes directly to my adult children as inheritance." She didn't seem shocked by my request, having worked with other clients who'd experienced family conflicts around estate planning. "What's driving these changes? If you don't mind me asking." "Sometimes families can work through misunderstandings about inheritance expectations." I briefly explained what I'd overheard in my kitchen, Patricia's expression growing increasingly grave as I described my children's casual discussion of my death as a financial opportunity. She took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific comments they'd made. "I see," she said when I finished. "Eleanor, I have to ask this directly. Are you making these decisions from anger, or from a genuine desire to redirect your legacy according to your values?" It was a fair question that deserved a thoughtful answer. "Both," I replied honestly. "I'm furious at their betrayal and callousness, but I'm also realizing that leaving them substantial inheritances would only enable the kind of entitled thinking that views elderly parents as assets to be managed, rather than people to be respected." Patricia nodded slowly. "In that case, let's talk about options. Charitable foundations require significant ongoing management, but they can provide tax benefits and ensure your money supports causes you care about. Educational trusts for grandchildren can be structured to encourage specific behaviors like academic achievement or community service." We spent the next 2 hours designing a comprehensive strategy that would achieve multiple goals simultaneously. The bulk of my assets would establish the Richard and Eleanor Brennan Foundation for Community Service, focused on supporting local food banks, literacy programs, and assistance for elderly residents who needed help maintaining independence in their own home. Each of my grandchildren would receive educational trusts funded with $50,000, accessible for tuition, books, and approved educational expenses through graduate school. The trusts would encourage academic excellence while providing meaningful support for their futures without creating dependency or entitlement. My adult children would each inherit $25,000, enough to acknowledge our family relationship without providing the financial windfall they'd been anticipating. The remainder of my estate would be donated to established charities I'd supported throughout my life, including the food bank they'd dismissed as unworthy of my contributions. "This structure will be legally solid," Patricia assured me as we finalized the details. "The charitable foundations provide tax benefits that actually increase the total impact of your donations, and the educational trusts are structured to prevent your children from accessing or redirecting those funds." I left her office feeling lighter than I had since my diagnosis. Instead of passively waiting for death while my children circled like vultures, I was actively ensuring my legacy would reflect my values, rather than their greed. Tuesday's meeting with Thomas Henley was equally productive. He reviewed the financial structures Patricia and I had designed, suggesting minor modifications that would strengthen the legal protections and ensure my intentions couldn't be successfully challenged in court. "The key is documenting your mental competency at the time these documents are signed," Thomas explained. "I'll arrange for an independent psychological evaluation that demonstrates you're making these decisions with full understanding of their implications. My children may claim I'm not thinking clearly because of my illness or medications," I warned him. "That's exactly why we need the evaluation," Thomas replied. "Dr. Rebecca Morrison specializes in capacity assessments for estate plan. She's testified in dozens of contested will cases, and her evaluations are rarely successfully challenged." As the evening progressed, I felt increasingly satisfied with the progress I'd made. The major components of my funeral were arranged and documented, with contracts signed and payments made. My children would need to handle only the timing and notification aspects, the details that couldn't be predetermined but required minimal decision-making. I prepared a simple dinner of soup and toast, foods that my diminished appetite could tolerate without difficulty. The kitchen felt especially cozy as autumn darkness settled outside, and I found myself thinking about all the meals I'd prepared in this room over the decades. Thousands of breakfasts before school, packed lunches for field trips, Sunday dinners that brought the entire family together, holiday feasts that required days of preparation. The memories weren't tinged with sadness, but rather with deep satisfaction at a life well lived. I'd been present for my children's daily needs, available for both routine care and special occasions. I'd created a home environment that was welcoming and stable, a foundation that had allowed Richard and me to raise confident, capable adults. After dinner, I settled into my favorite chair in the living room, with a cup of the herbal tea Sarah had brought. The room was filled with photographs and mementos from our family's history. Vacation pictures, school portraits, wedding photos, images of grandchildren at various stages of growth. Each frame held memories that had shaped my understanding of love, commitment, and the profound responsibility of nurturing other human beings. My grandchildren would remember me primarily through stories their parents told, since they were still young enough that my death would become family history rather than personal loss. But Sarah's boys, 15 and 17, were old enough to form lasting memories of their grandmother. I hoped they would remember my chocolate chip cookies, the way I let them stay up late watching movies during sleepovers, the patient attention I gave to their stories about school drama and teenage concern. Jennifer's children were younger, 8 and 11, still in the phase where grandparents represented safety and unconditional acceptance. They would miss our weekend adventures, the trips to museums and parks where we could explore together, without the time pressures that limited their interactions with their busy parents. Michael's relationship with his children had been complicated by his divorce, but his 13-year-old daughter Emma often spent weekends with me when she visited her father. She was a thoughtful child who shared my love of reading, and we'd developed a tradition of discussing books over hot chocolate and homemade cookies. Those conversations would end with my death, but I hoped the love of literature I'd encouraged would continue to enrich her life. Thinking about these grandchildren made me realize I wanted to create specific gifts for each of them, personal items that would help them remember our relationship in years to come. Not expensive presents, but meaningful objects that reflected our shared interests and experience. For Sarah's older son, David, who was passionate about baseball and hoped to play in college, I could pass along Richard's collection of vintage baseball cards. Richard had been a devoted Red Sox fan, and his carefully maintained cards from the 1960s and 1970s had both sentimental and monetary value. Her younger son Thomas loved to build with Legos and had expressed interest in architecture. I had a box of Richard's engineering textbooks from his college years, along with some basic drafting tools that might inspire Thomas to explore technical design. Emma, Michael's daughter, would treasure my collection of classic novels, especially the first edition copies of books by female authors who'd inspired my own love of reading. I wanted her to understand that women's voices and stories were valuable, that literature could provide both escape and insight throughout her life. Jennifer's daughter Sophia was an artist in the making, constantly drawing and creating with whatever materials she could find. My wooden jewelry box, hand-carved by Richard during our early marriage, would provide her with a special place to store art supplies or treasures. The box itself was beautiful enough to inspire creativity, while carrying the story of her grandparents' love. Her son Marcus was fascinated by gardening and had helped me plant vegetables during summer visits. I could prepare a collection of seeds from my most successful plants, along with Richard's gardening journals that documented decades of experiments with different varieties and techniques. These gifts would need to be prepared carefully, with letters explaining their significance and the memories associated with each item. I wanted my grandchildren to understand not just what they were receiving, but why these particular objects mattered and how they connected to our shared experiences. The evening was growing late, but I felt energized by the sense of purpose that had guided my day. Planning my funeral and considering legacy gifts had transformed my perspective on the remaining weeks or months of my life. Instead of passively waiting for death, I was actively preparing for it in ways that honored my relationships and values. I made notes about the grandchildren's gifts and added them to the folder I was creating for all my end-of-life preparations. Tomorrow I would begin gathering the specific items and writing the accompanying letter. The process would probably take several days, but I had time and the mental clarity to complete it properly. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on the unexpected peace I'd found in confronting my mortality directly. The diagnosis had initially felt like a death sentence, a cruel interruption of the comfortable routine I'd established as a widow, but today's planning had revealed it as something different, an opportunity to conclude my life with intentionality and grace. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I'd done everything possible to ease my children's burden and preserve the memory of our relationships. The funeral arrangements were complete, the legacy gifts were planned, and the practical details were organized. My death would still bring grief and disruption to my family's lives, but it wouldn't bring chaos or confusion about my wishes. That night I slept more peacefully than I had since receiving my diagnosis, comforted by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of purposeful preparation. I was dying, but I was dying well, and that distinction felt like the final gift I could give both to myself and to the people I loved most. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of quiet activity and careful preparation. Each morning I woke with renewed purpose, tackling different aspects of my end-of-life arrangements with the same methodical attention I'd once devoted to organizing Christmas celebrations or planning family vacations. The difference was that this time, I was the guest of honor who wouldn't be attending the event. Dr. Inez had adjusted my medication schedule during my last appointment, increasing the dosage of pain management drugs, while reducing some of the supplements that were no longer providing meaningful benefit. The changes left me feeling more comfortable physically but slightly more detached mentally, as if I were observing my life through a soft filter that muted sharp edges, but also diminished clarity. I'd completed the legacy gifts for my grandchildren, carefully wrapping each item and writing detailed letters explaining their significance. Richard's baseball cards were packaged with copies of old scorecards from games we'd attended together, along with a letter to David explaining his grandfather's lifelong devotion to the Red Sox and the patience required to appreciate baseball's subtle strategy. The engineering textbooks and drafting tools for Thomas came with stories about Richard's early career, his meticulous approach to problem solving, and the satisfaction he'd found in creating structures that would outlast his own lifetime. I'd included photographs of some of the buildings he'd helped design, hoping Thomas might someday walk past them and feel connected to his grandfather's legacy. Emma's collection of classic novels was accompanied by my reading journal, where I'd recorded thoughts and reactions to hundreds of books over the years. I wanted her to understand that reading was not a passive activity but an ongoing conversation between reader and author, a way of exploring ideas and emotions that might otherwise remain unexpressed. Sophia's jewelry box came with a small collection of art supplies and a letter encouraging her to view creativity as both a personal joy and a gift she could share with others. I'd included some of my own attempts at watercolor painting, modest efforts that demonstrated enthusiasm mattered more than technical skill. Marcus would receive the gardening materials along with detailed maps of my garden beds, showing which plants thrived in different locations and seasons. I'd prepared seed packets from my most successful vegetables and flowers, hoping he might someday create his own garden using varieties that had brought me decades of satisfaction. Each gift represented hours of thoughtful selection and preparation, but the process had brought me unexpected joy. Instead of simply disposing of possessions that would become meaningless after my death, I was transforming them into bridges between generations, ways for my grandchildren to maintain connection with family history and values. The funeral arrangements had been finalized with remarkable efficiency. Pastor Williams had reserved the church for a Thursday afternoon service, understanding that weekday timing would be more convenient for elderly friends who might struggle with weekend travel. Morrison's had confirmed the reception details and accepted full payment in advance. The cemetery had scheduled my burial for immediately following the service, weather permitting. I'd written my own obituary, crafting it with the same attention to accuracy and tone I'd once brought to school newsletters and church announcements. The challenge was striking the right balance between acknowledging accomplishments and avoiding the kind of self-aggrandizement that always made me uncomfortable at other people's funerals. Eleanor Patricia Brennan, age 78, passed away peacefully at her home in Millbrook after a brief illness. Born Eleanor Walsh in Boston, she was the beloved daughter of Irish immigrants, who instilled in her a lifelong appreciation for education, hard work and service to others. Eleanor graduated from Boston University with a degree in elementary education and taught third grade for 3 years before dedicating herself to raising her family. She was the devoted wife of Richard James Brennan for 48 years until his death, and together they raised 3 children, Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer. A woman of deep faith and quiet generosity, Eleanor was active in St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church for 37 years, serving on various committees and volunteering with the food bank for over 2 decades. She found great joy in her garden, her quilting circle, and especially in her 5 grandchildren, who will remember her chocolate chip cookies, her patient attention to their stories, and her unconditional love. Eleanor believed that a life well lived was measured not by personal achievements, but by the positive impact one had on others. She will be deeply missed by her family and the many friends whose lives she touched through her kindness and generosity. Reading the finished obituary gave me an odd sensation, like viewing my life from a great distance and finding it both smaller and larger than I'd imagined. Smaller because 8 decades of experience reduced to a few paragraphs revealed how much living defied summary. Larger because seeing my contributions listed together highlighted the cumulative impact of thousands of small daily choices to help others and strengthen community connections. My children had continued their regular visits throughout these weeks, each bringing their own style of care and concern. Sarah arrived with practical assistance, organizing my medications, updating my emergency contact information, and ensuring I had adequate supplies of food and household necessities. She approached my care with the same systematic efficiency she brought to her real estate transactions, creating lists and schedules that provided structure for my increasingly unpredictable energy levels. Michael focused on emotional support, spending hours listening to stories about his childhood and asking questions about family history he'd never thought to explore while Richard was alive. He seemed particularly interested in understanding his father's personality and values, perhaps searching for guidance about his own future after the disruption of his divorce. Jennifer brought her characteristic blend of nurturing and anxiety, cooking elaborate meals I couldn't eat, and then worrying that I wasn't maintaining adequate nutrition. She cleaned my house with fierce determination, as if eliminating dust and disorder could somehow slow the progression of my illness. Their efforts were touching and exhausting in equal measure. I appreciated their devotion while recognizing the emotional strain they were all experiencing. Watching a parent die even when death is expected and natural challenged adult children in ways they rarely anticipated. They were simultaneously trying to care for me, process their own grief, and maintain their regular responsibilities to their families and career. I'd begun encouraging them to spend time together without me, suggesting they meet for dinners or family activities that didn't revolve around my care. They needed to strengthen their relationships with each other, both for immediate support during my final illness, and for long-term connections that would outlast my lifetime. It was during one of these suggested family gatherings that everything changed. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of November weather that discouraged outdoor activities and made everyone want to stay inside with hot beverages and comfort food. I'd slept poorly, waking repeatedly with the restless discomfort that had become increasingly common as my body struggled with the advancing cancer. The hospice nurse arrived for her weekly visit around 10 o'clock, checking my vital signs and adjusting medications based on my reports of pain levels and sleep patterns. Nancy was a kind woman in her 50s, who'd been caring for terminally ill patients for over 20 years. She had the rare ability to be both professionally competent and genuinely compassionate, never minimizing my concerns while avoiding false optimism about my prognosis. "Your blood pressure is a bit lower than last week," she noted while updating my chart. "How's your appetite? Are you managing to eat regularly?" I admitted that food had become increasingly unappealing, that even my favorite dishes now seemed too rich or flavorful for my diminished digestive capacity. Nancy nodded with understanding, explaining that appetite loss was normal during end-stage illness, and that I shouldn't force myself to eat beyond what felt comfortable. "The most important thing is staying hydrated," she advised. "Small sips of water or herbal tea throughout the day. Your family might worry about the weight loss, but your body is conserving energy for essential functions now." After Nancy left, I settled into my favorite chair in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea and the morning newspaper. Reading had become more difficult as my concentration waned, but I still enjoyed scanning the headlines and obituaries, feeling connected to the broader community I would soon be leaving. Around noon, I heard multiple cars arriving in my driveway. Through the front window, I could see Sarah's sedan and Michael's truck, followed by Jennifer's small SUV. They'd planned to have lunch together at Michael's apartment, but apparently they'd decided to stop by my house first. I felt a flutter of pleasure at this unexpected visit, imagining we might share a brief but pleasant conversation before they continued with their plans. Sarah used her key to enter, calling out her usual greeting as the three of them came through the front door together. They seemed unusually animated, their voices carrying an energy that had been absent during recent visits. Perhaps they were beginning to adjust to my diagnosis, finding ways to maintain normal family interactions despite the shadow of impending loss. "Mom, we're here," Sarah announced as they appeared in the living room doorway. "We brought lunch from that deli you like, thought we could all eat together." The suggestion was appealing, since I'd managed only toast and tea for breakfast and was beginning to feel the hollow weakness that came with inadequate nutrition. "That sounds lovely, dear. What did you bring?" Jennifer held up bags from Goldstein's Delicatessen, the family-owned business that had been serving our neighborhood for over 30 years. "Chicken soup, matzo ball soup, some of that rye bread you always order, nothing too heavy." We moved into the kitchen, where they began unpacking containers and setting out bowls and spoons. The familiar ritual of sharing a meal felt comforting and normal, a reminder that some aspects of family life continued unchanged despite my declining health. The conversation during lunch was unusually lively, touching on topics that had nothing to do with my medical condition or care needs. Sarah described a particularly difficult client who couldn't decide between 3 different houses, each with distinct advantages and drawbacks. Michael shared funny stories about insurance claims, including one involving a man who'd tried to collect damages for a car allegedly destroyed by a meteorite. Jennifer talked about her students' preparations for the upcoming holiday pageant, including one little boy who insisted on playing all the reindeer instead of just Rudolph. Their animated storytelling reminded me of family dinners from years past, when the children had competed for attention by sharing increasingly elaborate accounts of their daily adventures. After we finished eating, they insisted on cleaning up while I rested in the living room. I could hear them talking and laughing in the kitchen as they washed dishes and put away leftover food. The sound of their voices blending together brought back memories of childhood afternoons, when they'd worked together on household chores, bickering and joking in equal measure. But something in their conversation began to shift as I listened more carefully. The tone became more focused, more businesslike, as if they were transitioning from social pleasantries to serious discussion. I couldn't make out specific words from my position in the living room, but the rhythm of their speech suggested they were addressing practical matters rather than sharing casual observations. Curiosity overcame my intention to rest. I rose quietly from my chair and moved closer to the kitchen doorway, positioning myself where I could hear their conversation without being visible to them. What I heard in the next few minutes shattered every assumption I'd held about my children's motivations and character. "So we're all agreed that the house should be listed as soon as possible after the funeral," Sarah was saying in her professional real estate voice. "The market's still strong, and we don't want to wait until spring when inventory typically increases." Michael's response was equally matter-of-fact. "What about the contents? Some of her furniture is antique, worth decent money, if we sell it properly. But most of the stuff is just sentimental junk that nobody really wants." "I'll handle the estate sale," Jennifer added. "My neighbor runs them as a side business. She can sort through everything and price it appropriately. We'll want to remove any items we actually want to keep before she starts." They were discussing the disposal of my life's possessions as if I were already dead, as if the house and everything in it had already become their inheritance to manage and liquidate. But what came next was even more shocking. "What's our best estimate of the total value?" Sarah asked. "I mean, I know she's been private about money, but the house alone should be worth at least $400,000 in this market. The life insurance policies total another $200,000, Michael replied. "I helped her review them last year when she was updating beneficiaries. Plus whatever she has in savings and investments, though she's never been specific about amounts." Jennifer's voice carried a note of frustration. "She's always been so secretive about finances. Remember how Dad used to handle all the money decisions? She probably has no idea what she's actually worth." "Well, we'll find out soon enough," Sarah responded. "I've already contacted that estate attorney, Thomas Henley, about expediting the probate process. He says if we're organized with the documentation, we can probably wrap everything up within 6 months." The casual way they discussed timeline and procedures made my blood run cold. They weren't just planning for my death, they were eagerly anticipating it, calculating the financial benefits they would receive, and organizing the most efficient methods for claiming their inheritance. But Michael's next comment revealed an even more disturbing perspective. "Honestly, this is probably the best outcome for everyone. She's been declining mentally since Dad died, making poor decisions about money and household management. At least this way, we can ensure the assets are preserved instead of watching her spend everything on unnecessary expenses." "Like what?" Jennifer asked. "The landscaping service she hired last spring cost almost $3,000, Sarah replied. The house doesn't need that level of maintenance, especially when we're probably going to sell it anyway. And she's been giving money to charities without really understanding how much she can afford to donate. I stood frozen in the hallway, barely breathing as I processed their words. They viewed my independent decision-making as evidence of mental decline. My choice to hire professional help with yard work that had become physically challenging was seen as wasteful spending. My charitable contributions, carefully budgeted from my discretionary income, were characterized as irresponsible behavior that threatened their future inheritance. Jennifer continued the theme. She's definitely not thinking clearly about finances. Last month she mentioned wanting to increase her donation to the food bank because they're seeing more families in need. I tried to explain that she needs to conserve her resources for medical expenses, but she just smiled and said she'd managed money successfully for decades. That's exactly the kind of thinking that worries me, Michael said. She's not considering the bigger picture, the impact on all of us, if she spends down her assets on causes that don't really need the money. We scheduled the psychological evaluation for Thursday, giving me time to prepare mentally for what would essentially be a test of my cognitive abilities and decision-making capacity. Thomas explained that Dr. Morrison would assess my understanding of my assets, my family relationships, and the consequences of my estate planning decisions. She'll also evaluate whether you're making these choices freely or under any form of duress or undue influence. Thomas added, based on what you've told me about overhearing your children's conversation, it sounds like you're responding to information rather than pressure. Wednesday passed quietly as I prepared for the psychological evaluation and reflected on the dramatic changes I was implementing. The original funeral arrangements remained valid, but now they would serve a different purpose. Instead of a memorial service for grateful children inheriting their mother's life savings, it would become a celebration of a woman who'd chosen to direct her legacy according to her own principle. I found myself wondering how my children would react when they learned about the restructured inheritance. Would they feel remorse for their callous attitude, or would they simply be angry about losing the money they'd been counting on? Either way, they would finally understand that their mother had been far more aware and capable than they'd assumed. Dr. Morrison arrived at my house Thursday morning, a professional woman in her 50s who specialized in psychological evaluations for legal purposes. She spent over 3 hours conducting a comprehensive assessment that covered my medical history, current mental status, understanding of my financial situation, and reasoning behind the estate planning changes. Ms. Brennan, she said as we concluded the evaluation, based on our discussion, I'm confident that you fully understand the nature and consequences of your estate planning decision. Your reasoning is clear, your memory is excellent, and your judgment appears sound despite the emotional stress of your diagnosis. What about my children's potential claims that I'm not thinking clearly? Your decision-making process demonstrates logical reasoning based on new information about family dynamics, Dr. Morrison replied. That's not mental incapacity. That's adaptive thinking in response to changed circumstances. She promised to have her written report completed within 48 hours, providing Thomas with the documentation he needed to finalize my new will and trust togdents. Everything was proceeding more smoothly than I'd dared hope. Friday morning brought unexpected visitors when Sarah and Michael arrived together, ostensibly to check on my well-being but clearly concerned about something specific. They seemed nervous as they settled into my living room, exchanging glances that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation. Mom, we've been talking, Sarah began carefully, and we're worried that you might be making some decisions about money that you'll regret later. The irony of their concern was almost amusing, considering what I'd overheard in my kitchen just days earlier. What kind of decisions are you worried about? I asked innocently. Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. Well, we know you've been meeting with your financial advisor and attorney lately. We just want to make sure you're not being pressured into changing things that you've had in place for years. They'd been monitoring my activities, probably through casual questions to neighbors or by checking with service providers. The level of surveillance felt invasive and controlling, confirming my decision to exclude them from knowledge about my actual plans. I appreciate your concern, I replied calmly, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The The meetings you're referring to are just routine reviews to ensure everything is current and properly documented. Sarah's expression remained skeptical. It's just that major changes during terminal illness can sometimes be contested later if there are questions about mental capacity or outside influence. The threat was subtly delivered but unmistakable. They were prepared to challenge any modifications I made to my estate plan, claiming I wasn't competent to make such decisions. Their assumption that I would be vulnerable to legal challenges revealed how completely they underestimated both my planning and my determination. I understand your concerns, I said, maintaining my composed demeanor. Rest assured that any changes I make will be legally sound and properly documented. I'm not a naive elderly woman being taken advantage of by unscrupulous advisors. They seemed frustrated by my calm responses, having clearly expected either guilty admissions or defensive reactions that would support their narrative of declining mental capacity. Instead, they were encountering the same sharp intelligence that had successfully managed household finances and raised 3 children to adulthood. After they left, I called Thomas immediately to report their visit and their implied threats about contesting my estate plan. He took detailed notes about their comments and assured me that Dr. Morrison's evaluation would provide strong protection against such challenges. Eleanor, it sounds like they're already positioning themselves to claim undue influence or diminished capacity, Thomas observed. The fact that they're monitoring your activities and questioning your decision-making actually strengthens our documentation of why you're making these changes. The weekend passed with unusual peace as I reflected on the dramatic transformation of my circumstance. A week earlier, I'd been a dying woman focused on easing her children's grief through thoughtful funeral planning. Now I was a strategic actor protecting her legacy from people who'd revealed themselves as unworthy of her trust and generosity. Monday brought the completion of all legal documents. Thomas had worked over the weekend to finalize my new will, the charitable foundation paperwork, and the educational trust agreements for my grandchildren. Everything was legally bulletproof and ready for my signature. These documents reflect exactly what we discussed, Thomas explained as we reviewed each section. The charitable foundation will be managed by an independent board of directors that includes Pastor Williams, the head librarian from the public library and the executive director of the food bank. The choice of board members was deliberate, representing institutions and values that had shaped my life rather than family members who might be influenced by personal financial interest. These people understood my commitment to community service and would ensure the foundation's activities aligned with my intention. The educational trusts for your grandchildren are structured to provide maximum flexibility for legitimate educational expenses while preventing any access by their parents, Thomas continued. And the direct inheritances for your children are clearly specified to prevent any claims that you forgot to include them or made errors in distribution. Signing the documents felt like the completion of a long journey rather than a single legal transaction. Each signature represented a conscious choice to direct my legacy according to my values rather than my children's expectations or financial needs. The psychological evaluation report arrived Tuesday, confirming Dr. Morrison's verbal assessment that I possessed full mental capacity and was making informed decisions based on rational reason. Thomas incorporated the report into the legal file supporting my estate plan, creating a comprehensive record that would be extremely difficult to challenge successfully. Eleanor, I have to say that this is one of the most thoroughly documented estate plans I've ever prepared. Thomas commented as we finalized everything. Your children would need to prove fraud or forgery to contest these documents, and frankly, the evidence doesn't support such claims. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction at having outmaneuvered children who'd assumed their elderly mother was too naive and declining to protect herself from their scheming. They'd underestimated both my awareness of their true motivations and my capacity for strategic response. The final step was informing my grandchildren about the educational trusts, though I decided to wait until after my death for them to learn the full detail. Instead, I wrote letters to each of them explaining my hopes for their futures and encouraging them to pursue their dreams with confidence and integrity. These letters were different from the legacy gifts I'd prepared earlier, before discovering my children's true nature. Now they carried additional weight as communications from a grandmother who wanted to ensure her grandchildren understood the importance of character and values over financial gain. For David, I wrote about the satisfaction that comes from working hard for goals that matter, using his grandfather's dedication to engineering projects as an example of finding purpose through professional excellence. For Thomas, I emphasized creativity and innovation, encouraging him to use his architectural interests to design buildings that would improve people's lives. Emma's letter focused on the power of education and critical thinking, urging her to question assumptions and seek truth through careful research and analysis. Sophia received encouragement to use her artistic talents for both personal expression and community enrichment. Marcus learned about the patience and dedication required for gardening, metaphors that applied equally to building character and maintaining relationships. Each letter concluded with the same message, that their grandmother loved them unconditionally, but expected them to earn their achievements through effort and integrity, rather than depending on inherited wealth or family connection. As November progressed toward December, I felt increasingly prepared for whatever time remained to me. The practical arrangements were complete, the legal protections were in place, and my legacy would reflect my values rather than my children's greed. My physical condition continued to decline gradually, but my mental clarity remained sharp and focused. The hospice nurse noticed my improved emotional state during her weekly visits, commenting that I seemed more peaceful and settled than many terminal patients she'd observed. "You appear to have found some resolution about end-of-life concerns," Nancy observed during one visit. That kind of acceptance can be very beneficial for managing both physical symptoms and emotional distress. She had no idea how accurate her assessment was, though she was attributing my peace to spiritual acceptance rather than strategic satisfaction. I had indeed found resolution, but it came from ensuring my children would receive exactly what they deserved rather than what they expected. The phone calls and visits from Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer continued regularly, their solicitous concern feeling increasingly artificial as I recognized their underlying motivation. They were maintaining relationships with someone they viewed as a source of future financial benefit, performing caregiving duties that would support their claims to grateful inheritance. Each interaction reinforced my conviction that restructuring my estate had been the right decision. They'd forfeited their right to my generosity through their willingness to reduce our relationship to a financial transaction. Now they would learn that such calculations could work in both directions, with consequences they'd never anticipated. December brought the first significant snowfall of the season, transforming my garden into a peaceful winter landscape that reminded me of countless previous years when I'd watched the seasons change from these same windows. The continuity of natural cycles provided comfort as I faced the approaching end of my own season. I spent increasing amounts of time in contemplation, reflecting on the life I'd lived and the legacy I was leaving. The dramatic changes to my estate plan represented only the most recent chapter in a story that had been shaped by decades of small daily choices to prioritize kindness, integrity, and service to others. My children had forgotten those lessons in their eagerness to claim material benefits from my death, but my grandchildren still had opportunities to learn different values, supported by educational resources that would encourage their development into thoughtful, contributing adults. The foundation would continue supporting community organizations long after my death, providing assistance to vulnerable populations, and maintaining the charitable giving that had been important to Richard and me throughout our marriage. In that sense, our partnership would continue even beyond my death, our shared values enacted through institutional structures that would outlast both of our lifetimes. As Christmas approached, I realized this would be my final holiday season. Instead of sadness, I felt gratitude for having had sufficient time to arrange my affairs according to my principles. Many people died without such opportunities, leaving behind confusion and conflict that damaged family relationships for generations. My children would be hurt and angry when they learned about the inheritance they weren't receiving. But hopefully, with time and reflection, they might come to understand that their actions had consequences, and that relationships based on financial expectations were ultimately hollow and destructive. The greatest tragedy wasn't that they would receive less money than anticipated, but that they'd revealed themselves to be people who valued their mother's death more than her life. That knowledge would have to be punishment enough for their betrayal, because financial consequences alone couldn't restore the trust and respect they'd destroyed through their calculating attitude toward my mortality. Christmas morning arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed my neighborhood into a winter wonderland worthy of greeting cards. I watched from my living room window as families emerged from their homes, children bundled in colorful coats dragging sleds toward the hill behind the elementary school. The scene filled me with bittersweet nostalgia for holidays, when my own children had been young enough to find magic in snow days and presents under the tree. This would be my last Christmas, a fact I'd accepted with surprising equanimity. The months since restructuring my estate had brought an unexpected peace that made facing death feel less like defeat and more like completion. I'd ensured my legacy would reflect my values rather than my children's greed, and that knowledge provided comfort no amount of medical intervention could have achieved. The family gathering was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Sarah's house, a tradition that had continued since Richard's death 5 years ago. In previous years, I'd looked forward to these celebrations as opportunities to watch my grandchildren open presents and share the joy of extended family time. This year, I approached the gathering with anthropological curiosity, wondering how my children would behave now that they'd revealed their true attitudes toward my impending death. I'd prepared gifts for my grandchildren with particular care, selecting items that would have lasting meaning rather than momentary entertainment. Books for the older children, art supplies for Sophia, gardening tools sized for Marcus's small hand. Each gift came with a handwritten note expressing my love and hopes for their futures, though I couldn't yet tell them about the educational trust that would support their dreams long after my death. For my adult children, I'd chosen modest but thoughtful presents that acknowledged our relationship while avoiding anything that might seem overly generous or sentimental. Sarah received a silk scarf in her favorite color, Michael got a book about local history he'd mentioned wanting to read, and Jennifer would find a quilted table runner I'd made during my healthier month. The drive to Sarah's house took me through neighborhoods I'd known for decades, past homes where friends had lived and raised their families, many now occupied by younger generations, or standing empty as their elderly owners moved to assisted living facilities. The cycle of life was visible everywhere, reminding me that my own mortality was simply part of a larger natural process that continued regardless of individual circumstances. Sarah's house was already filled with the controlled chaos of family Christmas when I arrived. My grandsons David and Thomas were testing new video games in the family room, while their father attempted to assemble some complicated electronic device. The familiar sounds of holiday celebration felt both comforting and distant, as if I were observing traditions from outside rather than participating as a central family member. Jennifer and her family had arrived before me, their children already deep into the present opening ritual that dominated Christmas morning in houses with young children. Sophia was carefully unwrapping a doll while Marcus struggled with tape that seemed determined to resist his efforts to access whatever treasure lay beneath the festive paper. Michael appeared in the doorway as I was hanging my coat in Sarah's front closet, offering his usual awkward hug and inquiring about my health with the cautious concern that had characterized all our interactions since my diagnosis. I assured him I was feeling well enough to enjoy the celebration, though privately I wondered how long I could maintain the energy required for family social events. "Mom, you look wonderful," Sarah called from the kitchen where she was orchestrating the complex logistics of Christmas dinner for 11 people. "I was worried the drive might be too much, but you seem to have more color than the last time I saw you." Her observation was probably accurate, since the satisfaction of having outmaneuvered my children's inheritance schemes had indeed improved my emotional state. Physical decline continued relentlessly, but mental clarity and purpose had provided an energy that medical treatment alone couldn't have supplied. The morning progressed with the familiar rhythms of family gift exchange, multiple conversations happening simultaneously as adults tried to supervise children while catching up on each other's news. I found myself studying my children's interactions with new awareness of their underlying motivations, watching for signs of the calculating attitudes I'd discovered during their kitchen conversation weeks earlier. Sarah was playing her role as gracious hostess while managing the stress of coordinating a complex meal, but I noticed her frequent glances in my direction carried a different quality than simple concern for my comfort. There was an assessment in her gaze, as if she were monitoring my condition for signs that might affect their timeline for inheritance planning. Michael seemed more relaxed than he'd been during recent visits, perhaps because the family gathering format provided natural structure for our interaction. But when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him exchanging meaningful glances with his sisters, communications that suggested ongoing coordination about matters they weren't discussing openly. Jennifer was focused primarily on managing her own children's behavior and energy levels, but she too seemed to be paying unusual attention to my stamina and cognitive sharpness. The collective surveillance felt invasive and dehumanizing, confirming that they continued to view me more as a medical case to be monitored than as their mother deserving respect and privacy. The gift exchange provided particularly revealing moments. When my grandchildren opened their presents, their genuine excitement and gratitude reminded me of why I'd established educational trust to support their future. These children deserved opportunities to develop their talents and pursue their dreams, without being corrupted by the entitled attitudes their parents had demonstrated. David was especially thrilled with the baseball biography I'd selected, immediately settling into a corner to begin reading, despite the ongoing celebration around him. Thomas examined his architecture book with the serious attention he gave to anything related to building and design. Both boys embodied the curiosity and appreciation for learning that I hoped their trust funds would nurture throughout their educational journey. When my adult children opened their modest gifts, their reactions were polite but perfunctory, clearly disappointing compared to whatever they'd been expecting. I could almost see them calculating the difference between silk scarves and substantial cash gifts, wondering whether my restrained generosity indicated declining mental capacity or simply reduced resources. "These are lovely, Mom," Sarah said, holding up the scarf with enthusiasm that seemed slightly forced. "The color is perfect. You always remember what I like." The comment carried an undertone that suggested she'd been hoping for something more valuable, perhaps jewelry or electronics, that would indicate I was still thinking clearly about gift giving. My choice of modest presents was apparently being interpreted as evidence of either financial constraints or cognitive decline, both of which supported their narrative about my diminished capacity. During dinner, the conversation touched on various family updates and holiday plans, but I noticed how frequently the topics circled back to questions about my medical condition and living arrangements. Were the medications making me drowsy? Was I managing okay with grocery shopping and household maintenance? Had I given any more thought to hiring help with housework or yard care? Each question seemed innocent enough in isolation, but collectively they painted a picture of concerned children, monitoring their elderly mother's declining independence. The subtext was clear: they were documenting evidence that could support future claims about my need for assistance with decision-making, particularly financial decisions. "We've been talking," Jennifer said during dessert, her voice carrying the careful tone people use when approaching sensitive subjects. "All of us are worried about you being alone in that big house, especially during winter weather. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? What if the power went out and you couldn't stay warm?" The concerns were legitimate enough to seem reasonable, but I recognized them as continuation of the campaign to position me as increasingly helpless and dependent. They were building a case for intervention, creating a record of offering assistance that I was supposedly too stubborn or confused to accept. "I appreciate your worry," I replied calmly, "but I have excellent support systems in place. The hospice nurse visits regularly, I have neighbors who check on me, and all my emergency contacts are current and accessible." Sarah leaned forward with the expression she used when presenting real estate offers to reluctant sellers. "But Mom, those are just basic safety measures. We're talking about comprehensive support that would let you age in place with dignity and security." Aging in place with dignity, as if my current independent living somehow lacked those qualities. Their language revealed how completely they'd adopted the perspective that elderly parents were problems to be solved, rather than autonomous individuals, capable of making their own choices about their living arrangements. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far they were prepared to go with their intervention plans. Michael cleared his throat, apparently designated as spokesman for whatever they'd decided among themselves. "Well, we think you should consider having someone come in daily to help with cooking and cleaning, maybe even overnight assistance, so there's always someone available if you need help. And of course," Sarah added smoothly, It would make sense to consolidate your financial management so you don't have to worry about bills and investment decisions. We could handle all of that, make sure everything's taken care of properly. There it was, the real agenda beneath their expressed concerns about my safety and comfort. They wanted control of my finances, ostensibly for my own protection, but actually to prevent me from making any decisions that might reduce their anticipated inheritance. That's very thoughtful, I said, my voice neutral despite my inner fury at their manipulative approach. Let me think about it and we can discuss specifics after the holiday. The deflection seemed to satisfy them temporarily, though I could see they'd hoped for either immediate agreement or resistance they could characterize as unreasonable stubbornness. My calm response didn't give them the reaction they needed to support their narrative about my declining judgment. The remainder of the celebration proceeded with forced normalcy, everyone pretending the elephant in the room wasn't my approaching death and their competing agendas about managing my final month. I participated in conversations about grandchildren's school activities and holiday plans, but part of my attention remained focused on observing family dynamics. I was seeing clearly for the first time. When the gathering concluded and I prepared to drive home, all three children expressed concern about my traveling alone in the dark. They offered to have someone follow me, or even to drive me themselves, ostensibly for safety reasons, but actually to extend their oversight of my activities. I've been driving these streets for over 40 years, I reminded them gently. I think I can manage the 15-minute trip to my own house. Their reluctant acceptance of my independence felt like a small victory, proof that I could still assert my autonomy despite their increasing efforts to position me as incapable of sound decision-making. The drive home through quiet residential streets gave me time to process the evening's dynamics and confirm my conviction that restructuring my estate had been absolutely necessary. These people had already written me off as a declining burden whose only remaining value lay in the inheritance they expected to receive. They deserved to learn exactly how expensive that attitude would become. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed with unusual tranquility as I reflected on the year's dramatic developments and prepared mentally for whatever 2024 might bring. My physical condition continued its gradual decline, but the psychological satisfaction of having protected my legacy provided strength that surprised both me and my medical caregivers. Nancy, the hospice nurse, commented during her weekly visit that I seemed more settled and peaceful than many terminal patients she'd observed. You appear to have found some resolution about end-of-life concerns, she observed. That kind of acceptance can significantly improve quality of life during this phase. She had no idea how accurate her assessment was, though she attributed my peace to spiritual acceptance rather than strategic satisfaction. I had indeed found resolution, but it came from ensuring my ungrateful children would receive exactly what they deserved rather than what they expected. New Year's Eve arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that encouraged staying indoors with hot tea and quiet contemplation. I spent the evening reviewing the year's accomplishments, particularly the legal documents that would ensure my legacy reflected my values rather than my children's greed. The charitable foundation was structured to provide ongoing support for community organizations that had been important to Richard and me throughout our marriage. The food bank would receive substantial annual funding, as would literacy programs and services for elderly residents who needed assistance maintaining independence in their own home. My grandchildren's educational trusts were designed to provide maximum support for their academic and personal development, while preventing their parents from accessing or redirecting those resources. Each child would have opportunities to pursue their dreams without financial constraints, free from the calculating attitudes that had corrupted their parents' perspective. The reduced direct inheritances for Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer were carefully calculated to acknowledge our family relationship without rewarding their callous treatment of my mortality. $25,000 each was generous enough to avoid claims that I'd forgotten them, or made errors in distribution, but modest enough to convey my disappointment in their character. As midnight approached and 2024 began, I felt profound gratitude for having had sufficient time and clarity to arrange my affairs according to my principles. Many people died without such opportunities, leaving behind confusion and conflict that damaged family relationships for generations. January brought the return of routine medical appointments, and gradual adjustment to my declining energy levels. Dr. Martinez confirmed during my monthly visit that the cancer was progressing as expected, though he was pleased by my stable emotional state and effective pain management. "How are you feeling about your prognosis?" he asked during one appointment, his tone carrying the careful concern medical professionals used when discussing end-of-life issues. "I'm at peace with it," I replied honestly. "I've had time to put my affairs in order and ensure my family will be taken care of according to my wishes." He nodded approvingly, understanding that acceptance often came more easily to patients who felt they'd completed important personal business. What he couldn't know was that my peace came not from surrender but from strategic victory over people who'd tried to reduce me to an asset they were managing until transfer of ownership. My children continued their regular visits throughout January, maintaining the careful balance between concern and surveillance that had characterized their behavior since my diagnosis. They brought groceries and helped with household tasks while asking pointed questions about my financial management and decision-making process. During one visit, Sarah brought up the subject of power of attorney with renewed urgency, framing it as a necessary precaution rather than the control grab I knew it represented. "Mom, we really need to finalize some legal documents while you're still feeling well," she said, settling into my living room with a manila folder that clearly contained prepared paperwork. "Just basic authorizations that would let us help with bills and medical decisions if you become unable to handle them yourself." The documents she produced were more comprehensive than basic authorizations, including broad financial powers that would have given them control over all my accounts and investment decisions. They'd clearly been consulting with an attorney about the most effective ways to gain legal authority over my affairs. "These look quite extensive," I observed, scanning the pages without signing anything. "I'll need to have my own attorney review them before making any commit." Sarah's expression flickered with frustration before settling back into patient concern. "Of course, Mom. We just want to make sure everything's ready if the situation changes quickly. Sometimes terminal illness can progress faster than expected." The veiled threat was becoming familiar. Sign over control voluntarily or risk having it taken through legal proceedings if my condition deteriorated to the point where they could claim incompetence. They'd clearly researched their options and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. "I understand your concerns," I replied calmly. "Rest assured that I have excellent legal counsel and everything will be properly documented when the time comes." After she left, I called Thomas Henley to report their latest pressure tactics and discuss additional protections we might need to implement. He listened carefully to my description of their power of attorney documents and their implications about my potentially declining capacity. "Eleanor, they're clearly preparing for a more aggressive approach to gaining control of your affairs," Thomas observed. "The good news is that we have extensive documentation of your mental competence and decision-making capacity. The psychological evaluation alone would make it very difficult for them to successfully claim incompetence. What if they try to have me hospitalized or claim I'm being influenced by unscrupulous advisors?" I asked. "That's exactly why we created such thorough documentation," Thomas replied. "Dr. Morrison's evaluation specifically addressed those potential claims, and your decision-making process shows clear reasoning based on factual information about family dynamics, rather than outside manipulation." February brought an unexpected acceleration in my physical decline that caught both me and my medical team somewhat off guard. The cancer was progressing more rapidly than originally predicted, and Martinez adjusted my pain medication while suggesting we might need to consider more intensive symptom management. "How much time are we talking about now?" I asked directly, preferring honest information to vague optimism. "Probably weeks rather than months," he replied gently. "Maybe 6 to 8 weeks if your current trajectory continues, but Comfort Care can help ensure that time is as peaceful as possible." The shortened timeline created urgency about finalizing details that I'd planned to address over a longer period. I needed to complete letters to my grandchildren, ensure all legal documents were properly stored and accessible, and make final arrangements for the memorial service that would celebrate my life while revealing my true feelings about my children's behavior. I spent the next several days working with unusual focus and energy, driven by the knowledge that time was now truly limited. The letters to my grandchildren were completed and sealed, ready to be delivered after my death, along with the legal documents establishing their educational trust. Each letter emphasized values I hoped they would carry forward: integrity, kindness, the importance of education, and the satisfaction that comes from contributing to their community. I wanted them to understand that their grandmother had believed in their potential and invested in their futures, because she valued their character, not because she felt obligated to provide financial support. The funeral arrangements required some updating to reflect my shortened timeline. Pastor Williams was understanding about the accelerated schedule, and Morrison's restaurant confirmed they could accommodate the reception with minimal advance notice. Everything would proceed as originally planned, though sooner than expected. I also completed a final letter addressed to Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer, to be read during the memorial service or delivered afterward depending on circumstance. This letter would explain my estate planning decisions and provide them with the opportunity to understand how their behavior had influenced my choices. I write this letter not from anger but from sadness at discovering that the children I raised with such love and pride have become adults who value money more than relationships. The letter began. The conversation I overheard in my kitchen last November revealed attitudes toward my life and death that were both shocking and heartbreaking. I detailed exactly what I'd heard, quoting their comments about my declining mental capacity, their eagerness to sell my house, and their calculations about the inheritance they expected to receive. I explained how their casual discussion of my death as a financial opportunity had forced me to recognize that they viewed me not as their mother but as an asset to be managed until transfer of ownership. The charitable foundation and educational trusts I've established reflect values your father and I tried to instill in you throughout your childhood, the letter continued. Apparently those lessons didn't take root as deeply as we'd hoped, but perhaps your own children will learn different lessons about family loyalty, respect for elders, and the difference between loving someone and coveting their possession. The letter concluded with forgiveness but not reconciliation, love but not approval. I wanted them to understand that my decisions had consequences, but that those consequences came from their choices rather than my vindictiveness. I forgive you for seeing me as a burden rather than a person, for reducing our relationship to a financial calculation, and for planning my death as if it were a business transaction. The letter ended, but forgiveness doesn't mean pretending your actions had no consequence. The inheritance you expected has been redirected to causes that better reflect the values I held throughout my life. March arrived with the kind of false spring that made everyone eager for winter's end, though I knew I wouldn't see another real spring. My energy levels were declining noticeably, and simple tasks that had been manageable weeks earlier now required careful planning and frequent rest periods. Nancy increased her visits to twice weekly, monitoring my comfort levels and adjusting medications as needed. She also began discussing end-of-life logistics with gentle professionalism, ensuring I understood the process and knew what to expect as my condition continued to deteriorate. "Do you have family members you'd like us to contact when the time comes?" she asked during one visit. Sometimes people want to specify who should be notified first and what kind of immediate support might be needed. I provided the contact information for all three children while privately wondering how they would react to losing their financial windfall so close to claiming it. Would they feel genuine grief for my death, or would their disappointment about the inheritance overshadow any personal loss they experience? My physical decline accelerated dramatically during the second week of March, requiring round-the-clock nursing care and stronger pain medications that left me drowsy but comfortable. Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer began taking shifts at my bedside, ostensibly to provide comfort and support, but actually to ensure they were present when the moment came. Their vigil had an oddly theatrical quality, as if they were performing the role of devoted children for an audience that included medical professionals and each other. They spoke in hushed tones about my comfort and their love for me, but I could sense the underlying tension about inheritance issues that remained unresolved. During one of my more alert periods, Thomas Henley visited to confirm that all legal documents were properly executed and stored. He brought copies of everything for my review, including the letter that would explain my estate planning decisions to my children. "Eleanor, everything is exactly as you specified," he assured me. "The charitable foundation is established, the educational trusts are funded, and the reduced, direct inheritances are clearly documented. There's no ambiguity about your intentions or your mental capacity when these decisions were made, and the letter explaining my reasoning. I'll deliver it personally after the memorial service, Thomas replied. They'll understand exactly why you made these choices and how their own behavior influenced your decisions. The knowledge that my final message would be delivered brought unexpected peace. I'd ensured that my legacy would reflect my values, rather than their greed, and they would learn that actions have consequences even when the actor believes herself powerless to enforce them. On March 18th, surrounded by children who were grieving the loss of their anticipated inheritance more than the loss of their mother, I closed my eyes for the final time. My last coherent thought was satisfaction at having protected my true legacy from people who'd proven themselves unworthy of the trust and generosity I'd planned to bestow upon them. The memorial service, 3 days later, was everything I'd hoped it would be, a celebration of a life well lived, attended by friends and community members who'd known me as more than just a source of future financial benefit. Pastor Williams delivered a thoughtful eulogy that focused on my contributions to church and community rather than dwelling on the sadness of ending. The reception afterward provided opportunities for sharing memories and stories that painted a picture of someone who'd touched many lives through small daily kindnesses and consistent service to others. These were the relationships that had given my life meaning, connections based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than financial expectation. It was only after the guests had departed and the immediate family gathered for the reading of my will that my children learned the true extent of their miscalculation. Thomas Henley delivered the news with professional composure, explaining the charitable foundation, the educational trusts, and the dramatically reduced, direct inheritances. The silence that followed was profound and lasting. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice shaking with disbelief and fury. "This can't be legal," she whispered. She wasn't thinking clearly. The medication, the illness, she couldn't have made these decisions rationally. Thomas calmly produced Dr. Morrison's psychological evaluation along with the comprehensive documentation of my decision-making process. "Your mother was evaluated extensively for mental capacity and found to be fully competent. These documents will withstand any legal challenge you might consider." Michael's face had turned ashen as he processed the implications of inheriting $25,000 instead of the several $100,000 he'd been anticipating. But the house, the life insurance, the investments, where did all of that go? The Richard and Eleanor Brennan Foundation for Community Service received the bulk of the estate, Thomas explained. "Your mother was quite specific about wanting her legacy to support causes she'd cared about throughout her life." Jennifer began crying. Whether from grief or financial disappointment was impossible to determine. "I don't understand. Why would she do this to us? We're her children." Thomas handed them the letter I'd written, the final communication that would explain exactly why their inheritance had been redirected to more worthy causes. As they read my account of the kitchen conversation I'd overheard, their expressions shifted from confusion to horror as they realized I'd known about their calculating attitudes toward my death. The letter's final paragraphs provided the closure I'd needed to write but hadn't lived to deliver personally. "You taught me that family relationships could be reduced to financial calculation, that my death was something to be planned and managed for your benefit, rather than mourned as the loss of someone you love. I've simply applied those same calculating principles to my estate planning, directing my resources toward recipients who will use them according to values I actually hold rather than people who view generosity as an entitlement they've earned through genetic accident." The reading concluded with Thomas explaining the legal protections I'd established to prevent successful challenges to my decision. My children's shocked silence was broken only by occasional whispered conversations about potential legal options, all of which Thomas gently but firmly discouraged. They would go home that evening to houses they could no longer afford, lifestyles they could no longer maintain, and futures they would have to rebuild without the financial cushion they'd been counting on. Meanwhile, my money would begin its new life supporting food banks, literacy programs, and educational opportunities for children who would appreciate rather than expect such assistance. The grandmother who'd planned her own funeral to ease her children's burden had been revealed as a strategic thinker who'd protected her values from people who'd proven themselves unworthy of her trust. It was, I thought, from whatever perspective death allowed, exactly the ending this story deserved. 6 months after the memorial service, the ripple effects of my estate decisions had transformed my family's lives in ways they were still struggling to comprehend. Sarah's real estate business suffered as she couldn't maintain the professional image that expensive clothing and luxury car payments had provided. Without the inheritance she'd counted on, she was forced to downsize her home and enroll her sons in public school, explaining to confused teenagers why their lifestyle had suddenly changed so dramatically. Michael lost his apartment when he couldn't keep up with rent and alimony payments simultaneously. He moved into a modest studio across town, selling his furniture and taking on weekend work to make ends meet. His relationship with his daughter Emma became strained as he could no longer afford the activities and gifts that had characterized their previous visits together. Jennifer's family faced the most severe adjustments, with her husband's landscaping business failing completely during the economic stress. They moved in with her in-laws temporarily, a humiliating arrangement that put tremendous pressure on their marriage and created instability for their children who couldn't understand why their familiar world had disappeared. The Richard and Eleanor Brennan Foundation, meanwhile, flourished under the guidance of its independent board. The food bank expanded its services to include fresh produce deliveries for homebound elderly residents. The literacy program launched mobile libraries that brought books and reading instruction to underserved neighborhoods. Scholarships were awarded to deserving students whose families couldn't afford college tuition. My grandchildren's educational trusts remained untouched, growing steadily while waiting for their recipients to reach college age. David continued excelling in baseball and academics, unaware that his grandmother had ensured his talent wouldn't be limited by financial constraints. Emma discovered a passion for creative writing, supported by access to summer programs her father could never have afforded on his reduced income. The most profound change occurred in how my children related to each other and to money itself. The inheritance they'd expected to share had been the foundation of their financial planning for years. Without it, they were forced to confront the reality of their spending habits and lifestyle choices. The conversations that had once focused on managing their declining mother now centered on managing their own financial futures without the safety net they'd taken for granted. Sarah attempted to contest the will despite Thomas Henley's warnings about the futility of such action. She hired an attorney who quickly recognized the strength of the psychological evaluation and documentary evidence supporting my competence. After spending several $1,000s she couldn't afford on legal fees, she abandoned the challenge and was forced to accept that her mother had outsmarted them all. The community response to the foundation's work created an unexpected legacy that honored my memory while highlighting the contrast between my values and my children's behavior. Local newspapers featured stories about scholarship recipients and community programs funded by the foundation, always mentioning that the resources came from a woman who'd chosen to invest in her community's future rather than simply enriching her own family. These articles were painful reminders to my children of the respect and admiration I'd earned through decades of quiet service, recognition they'd never fully appreciated while I was alive. Friends and neighbors who approached them with condolences often mentioned my generosity and community spirit, inadvertently emphasizing how little they'd understood about their mother's character and priorities. The final irony became clear as the first anniversary of my death approached. The inheritance they'd schemed to claim would have provided temporary financial relief but wouldn't have addressed the fundamental problems in their approach to money management and personal responsibility. By forcing them to rebuild their lives without unearned wealth, I'd actually given them an opportunity to develop the kind of character and work ethic I'd tried to instill during their childhood. Whether they would recognize this gift and use it to become better people remained to be seen. But the foundation would continue its work regardless, ensuring that my life's accumulation of wealth would serve purposes worthy of the values Richard and I had shared throughout our marriage. My plan had succeeded completely. The children who'd seen my death as a financial opportunity had learned that treating family relationships as business transactions carried costs they'd never anticipated, and the community I'd served throughout my life would benefit from resources that might otherwise have been squandered on people who'd already proven themselves ungrateful for what they'd been given. Sometimes the best lessons are the most expensive ones. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.